Okay, so we're ready to go.
Amori, why do you look like you're in a coven?
Maybe I am. We're seeing Ozof a few minutes ago. She's gone off again.
Yeah, she's here.
She's not in a coven.
You're muted.
Okay, I'm back. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for disappearing for a second.
Yeah.
We're getting to see your beautiful face, and then you just went off.
And it's good to have you as well, being the only female on this panel.
Yes, that's something for the SBL chair to look into.
There's too much hardware on this.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, sirs.
Good afternoon.
Enjoy, I'm sorry.
Very well. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Endurance, good afternoon.
Oh. Mr. Moyi, good afternoon, sir. Davidson, good afternoon. I greet all of you. Thanks for all your support.
Thank you, Endurance.
Thank you so much.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Gubadia, CFR. Oh.
Live already?
Tama, good afternoon, sir.
Endurance, are we live?
Fully alive, sir.
Okay, so let's get going. The mandate from Mr. Chairman is that this is a 1-hour webinar, and I'd like us to do the best we can to keep to the mandate from our able chairman, Dr. Adoya Difulu. That said, I want to welcome you all to the inaugural session of the NBA-SBL Weekly Law Series. And this inaugural session is targeted at discussing a very pivotal aspect that pervades the business law landscape and that is bringing some level of transformation to how we do things. This week, we're going to be discussing the Nigerian Startup Act. It feels very good to call it the Nigeria Startup Act and not the bill. I want to particularly say that the section is very privileged to have the people at the front of this act who were part of the process from day one and have seen it come to fruition, the first phase come to fruition. Our discussion today is going to have Mr. Saratin Gwobadia, who is the Special Assistant to the President on Technology and Innovation, and as well as a team lead of the Nigerian Startup Act project. Mr. Gwobadia led an army of volunteers from the private sector, public sector, to create, collaborate, discuss, and bring to birth this phenomenal act, the Nigerian Startup Act. He's going to be speaking to us in a few minutes. I also have on this panel Mr. Davison Oturo. Mr. Davison Oturo is also very pivotal to the act. Davison led the legal and policy drafting team that drafted the act, discussed with stakeholders, picked their brains, looked at all the angles to it that will give us a viable and workable act. Davison is also going to be sharing his experience and giving key insights that will help illuminate us and put us in a place of understanding as far as the Nigerian Startup Act is concerned. I also have another, Davison also is a partner at Alex and an intellectual property expert, amongst other firsts. I also have on this panel the one who softens the hardware, very distinguished lawyer and partner at the law firm of Udo Udoma and Bello Sage, Mrs. Ozofu Latunde Ogemudia, a very seasoned lawyer, commercial law expert, and she's also going to be bringing to the table certain lucid points that will help us understand the act, especially from the implementation perspective. Without further ado, we'll go straight to the point. But before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the chairman of SBL, Dr. Adeoye Adefulu, and the team who have allowed us the opportunity to have this level of interaction. Dr. Adeoye's support for the Startup Act from its days as a bill to its present day as an act is worthy of commendation, and we express our appreciation to the entire section for supporting and pushing the message right from the days of it being an act. So I'd like to start this conversation from the originator. I like to call him that because he led the army of people, including yours truly, to build what we're building. And Mr. Gwobadia, I'd like to start by asking you to take us briefly through the journey that led us to the Nigerian Startup Act. To put things in context, I'd like to ask, what was the necessity that birthed the NSA? And by NSA, for the audience, I mean the Nigerian Startup Act. What was that necessity that gave birth to the NSA? I think that's a good place for us to start this conversation. Good. Mr. Gwobadia, over to you.
I thought you were breaking up there. Sorry.
Okay.
So, thank you for your question. Thank you for this group for having me today. It's interesting being in the midst of lawyers. I guess, you know, in the midst of lawyers, you have to make sure you cross your T's and dot your I's. I was even giggling when Uyi said, by the act, I mean, you know, the Nigerian Startup Act, while I'm still struggling to stop saying bill and say act. So please correct me if you hear me say bill instead of act, which it now is, thanks to some of your efforts here. So there are several reasons why we came to the conclusion that legislature was important for this particular ecosystem. What I found myself saying of recent is that, you know, the idea that is directed at tech-enabled businesses is quite intentional. This is the fastest growing sector globally, and Nigeria has a key role and key opportunity in that sector, being that one, we have the market, two, we have the natural resources, as in two-legged resources, brilliant young people. You know, between these two things, we're able to compete globally, right? So what we find in what we now say is that, you know, it's quite possible, and we hope that the very next you know, great startup that impacts the world comes from a Nigerian village, right? So policy and legislature is key to ensuring this happens. Now, I also tell people that every single provision in this bill, there we go, this act, you know, was put forth by, you know, entrepreneurs who have experienced it. It comes from a pain point. Even myself as well, being an entrepreneur in Nigeria before taking on this role. So it was brought forth from a number of engaging sessions that we had, and those sessions is what led to the provisions that are now in this act. And you know, I tend to just now narrow it down to simply this. You know, the entrepreneurs are out disrupting, creating disruptive solutions, innovative disruptive solutions, while the policymaker tends to what exists, right? The policymaker tends to what currently exists. And a lot of the issues that we experience is sometimes just comes from not having the enabling environment, or just the uncertainty in regulations and policies. And what we call uncertainty, you know, sometimes is just the fact that policymakers they see displacement, right? When disruptive exactly what he intends to do or she intends to do by disrupting a particular current way of doing business or current way of process of doing something. You know, the policymaker only sees displacement and wonders what has happened. And the natural reaction to that is to sometimes put a stop to it, or try to understand it. But in most instances, from experience, we know what has happened in the market. So ultimately, this bill is one meant to come in and help create a structure for this conversation to happen between policymakers and practitioners. So but I'll stop there for now and let other questions come.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gwobadia. It's good you've given a bit of context to the conversation. I'd like to go to Ozofu before going to Davidson. And just to ask, because there's a lot of excitement, especially amongst ecosystem players. There's also some level of, would I say, apathy from those who feel that this is just one of those laws. What really is the difference that the act is going to bring to the table? What is the value that's going to come by virtue of this act? And so I'd like to ask Ozofu. Ozofu is a partner in one of the big firms. I'm sure works with lots of startups and can feel this pulse. Ozofu, I'm sure you've looked at the act. How do you think that this Startup Act, with what you have seen, will help startups scale and build sustainable companies? What do you see in the act is there anything you see in the act that can help startups scale and build sustainable businesses?
Thank you for the question, and good afternoon to everyone. I have to say that, well, I think I am the only panelist that was not involved in drafting the act, so I'll try and hopefully give the market perspective based on the limited engagements I've had since the act came into force. I agree with you that maybe there's a bit of skepticism, but I don't think it's because of the act. I think it's maybe because of our operating environment and some of the things that have happened in the past. And so the act itself sets out some really laudable objectives. And I think the test will be whether we have the will to implement these objectives in a timely and efficient manner. But there, I mean, in terms of incentives and objectives for helping startups, there's no shortage in the act. So just before I highlight some of them, just some statistics. Nigeria's startup ecosystem is rated one of the top 3 in Africa in terms of investments into startups in maybe in the past 2 years, since 2020 to 2021, Nigeria accounts for about 35%. In sub-Saharan Africa, we're over 60%. So Nigeria is a market that is not to be ignored in this, startup ecosystem. I see it as the government recognizing this, seeing the data, seeing the inflow, and wanting to ensure that we position ourselves so that we're not just, here at the beginning of this, this era, but throughout the life of this fintech and startup and digital revolution, that Nigeria continues to be an attractive place for this sort of investments. So in terms of what the Act seeks to do, there is the Startup Investment Seed Fund of at least, which is supposed to be capitalized to at least 10 billion naira, and is supposed to be managed by the NSIA. That gives me a lot of confidence. The NSIA has a track record in making investments, substantial investments that to help the economy. And so the NSIA managing this sort of fund, hopefully will make much needed funding available, and local funding. because a lot of the funding that goes into startups based on the data, a lot of it is from foreign investors. But I think it would be wonderful if, you know, there's local capital that's committed to helping to get startups off the ground. There's also the credit guarantee scheme, which will help support startups as they seek to raise investments. Again, we'll have to wait and see. Maybe, I guess there will be regulations that will say the sorts of lenders that this scheme will be available to support lending from such institutions. But that's also a welcome development. There's the accelerator and incubator programs to help give startups access to accelerators and incubators. There's also the startup portal, which, I mean, if that is implemented as envisioned, it will be a fantastic initiative. So it's a portal where startups can register, and then when registered, there will be sections of the portal. So for instance, there'll be a section where they can carry out their CAC filings in an efficient manner. There'll be a section for registering trademarks and patents. There'll be a section for registering agreements with NOTAP, things like that. So if this can actually work, then that would be fantastic, because part of the problem that companies face getting off the ground in Nigeria is just how long it takes to beyond incorporation, which is thankfully still pretty straightforward. But when you need the other approvals that come after incorporation, it can take months. Sometimes you could be on something for a year, going back and forth to the regulator. So there will be a lot of regulatory buy-in across MDAs that's required to make this work. And so, like I said, if the will is there, if the buy-in is there, so it's not just the council that's set up by this act that is singing the song, but there's buy-in from the CBN, SEC, CSC, NOTAP, all the various agencies that are to collaborate to make the act, you know, effective. Then I think that we're going to see good times for startups in Nigeria. I just close by also drawing on the fact that there are fiscal and tax incentives, and then there's a commitment to fast track applications from startups. Thank you.
Fantastic. You know, nobody would believe that you are not part of the team that drafted the act, because you seem to understand it. Understand it. I'm sure Davis in somewhere will be like, okay, what's left for me to say? Everything. Anyway, Davison, you led the legal drafting team that drafted this phenomenal act. I'd like you to walk us through the key highlights of the act. Let's assume that some people in the audience really haven't looked at the gazetted copy of the act or don't have a firm understanding of it. I'd like you to do a crash course in 5 minutes, if that's possible.
5 minutes, right?
Over to
fine. You. That's fine. Thank God that we already had those offer do like 5 minutes already. So so I'll just add my own 5 minutes to that. But thanks and good afternoon, my fellow colleagues. Don't like Mr. Gubadia that I can lay claim to being part of the legal profession. So that's a one-up there. So the Nigerian Startup Act was an interesting journey. We had to look at quite a number of things, and we had to ask ourselves a few questions. How do we solve the existing problems? Mr. Gubadia touched on a few things, and which sort of was the at the inception stage, the questions that were being asked. And we said, look, do we set up another agency? At the last count, there were almost 900 MDAs in Nigeria. So that's not going to help us, right? And then you would have a commissioner or a DG or executive secretary. You have somebody at the top. You would then have people from different geopolitical zones. Maybe the National Assembly needs to confirm people. That implementation process to even set up a commission looked like it would be forever. And so we kicked out the commission part and we said, what's the next best thing we can probably do? And the reason why I'm saying this is to get to the council that was set up, because I've seen people look at the act and they've asked themselves, what is the purpose of this council? The council is almost like, I don't know how to put it now, but it's almost like a super pill that we placed in that act. And if you understand it, then you would realize that a lot of things can flow out of that, because on that council sits private sector individuals. So it's comprised of about 8 government, officials, which of course is the president and vice president, the central bank governor, the minister of finance and budget and planning, the minister of science and technology and innovation, the minister of communication and teleconomy, the DG of NIDA. And then you have 4 ecosystem guys, who are part of a consultative forum, which was also set up in the act. Now that consultative forum comprises of ecosystem guys who can then elect their members who would sit on the council. So you then have 4 people from the ecosystem sitting on that council. You would also have 2 traditional persons, one from the Computer Society of Nigeria, and then one from what's the name of that other the Nigeria? Because those were last minute traditions. There's also the computer professionals, private sector organizations. Now the purpose of that is so that we have, CPN, is so that we would have sufficient private sector conversations that will go on in that council, so that those who would effectively feel the pains and the success of the act, which is the innovators and the investors, would have their interests more or less covered by the council. And then having Mr. President sitting as the chairman of the council also means that there is enough executive buy-in. You could then have policies, regulations, and directives that can flow out from the council and will be implemented by NIDA, which sits as a secretariat. There's also a council agent that was set up, which serves as a monitoring and evaluation agent to ensure that there is effective implementation of the act. We took a lot of inspiration from existing startup laws that exist in Africa and other parts of the world. So we probably examine close to 20 startup laws and regulations to see what works and to see what we can pull out of them. One of the most exciting ones we had was looking at the Tunisia Startup Act, where they actually have that sort of private sector driven and ensures that there is effective implementation of the Tunisia Startup Act. We're looking at the council agent as well having that sort of role to play so that there is no lacuna and there are no gaps. Dozofu spoke about how the implementation can be the problem. We're looking at how we can solve that problem even before it arises by ensuring that on a periodic basis, the council agent then publishes and to both the council as well as to the general public, so that there is that understanding on how the incentives are being given to the startups and how they're able to implement them at the end of the process. A couple of guys have asked questions around the labeling process, and I still saw somebody throw out something on LinkedIn. Sometimes they just tag me randomly. So I read it and I say, okay, well, maybe there's still some education that's supposed to be done. They're like, why do you have to register at CAC? And then you now have to get labeled again. What you need to understand is that there are, God knows how many startups exist in Nigeria. And some people will just, can be blending tomato. You just say, okay, you're using electricity, so you're tech enabled. There has to be a sifting process to determine whether there is sufficient innovation that goes into your processes that would determine whether you are what can be considered tech enabled. And anywhere in the world, there will always be a sifting process, and that sifting process is where the labeling comes in, whereby you can then have the right type of startups with the proper metrics for growth, which you will then bring into your system and then you can help them grow. Again, looking at Tunisia, where the labeling process was actually put into good effect, we've seen a consistent growth in how the label startups have worked. When they started out, they only had 16 startups that were labeled. But in the first year when they came into play, I think they recorded almost $30 million revenue that came out from those 16 label startups. Now, this year alone, they probably have over 700 label startups from when the Act came into force in 2018 till now. And so you can imagine the revenue that has come out of that labeling process in itself, so that you can have them under some kind of controlled environment, grant them tax incentives, grant them seed investments, and then be able to track their growth. We consider that that may help us head towards succeeding on part of the plans on the bill, now an Act. But I'll stop there because my 5 minutes is up.
Thank you so much, Victor. And thank you so much, Davidson. It's very, very good that you put some things in clear perspective. And it's good that you mentioned Tunisia, because one of the key things that the Tunisian Startup Act has done for the Tunisian economy is the level of impact and growth that it has brought to the economy of the nation, even beyond just helping propel startups, right? So their GDP, a lot has improved for them, and flowing from the benefits that have come with the Startup Act. So, which means that it's a win-win really for both government and private sector. So I'm going to go back to Mr. Gwobadia, and I'm going to ask him a few questions before we continue. Before we go back to Zofu. Now we have the Startup Act. Davidson has taken us through the Act. Zofu has also done a very great job getting us to understand the benefits of the Act. But what is the expected impact, especially for government? And how will the Act help grow startups in Nigeria and help develop and improve our economy, vis-a-vis attracting investment, vis-a-vis creating ease of doing business? What is that impact that the Startup Act is going to bring by virtue of its enact?
Thank you. So let me take us one step back, and then I will address your question a bit more directly. I just wanted to sort of set a framework. By the way, Tunisia is saying that they love our council. So I just sat in a panel recently with Tunisia, and they publicly stated that in our bill, they love how we've used the council. So that's just a feedback to the drafting team. I don't think I had a chance to say that to Davidson. So one of the things that when you look at the bill that we're trying to encourage people to do is look at it from 5 bullets. Bullet number 1 being collaboration. Bullet number 2 being engagement. Bullet number 3 being incentives. Bullet number 4 being linkages, and bullet number 5 being support. So to your question of what are the impacts of the bill. So when I was recently on the panel, we were told first they clapped for Nigeria for having passed a Startup Act. They were very excited. All of Africa is very excited about this, but they also made statements to the fact that Nigeria is doing very well, right? That we have 3 to 4 or 5 unicorns, and that is fantastic. To which I said, look, looking at Nigerians' population and looking at the fact that we have all the needs here and the market that we have, that we're only just starting, that we're in an infancy, right? And then what is key to ensure that we put this train on the right track is the right policy development and the right legislator to help guide. And that's exactly what the bill brings to the ecosystem. When you think about collaboration and engagement within policymakers and the private sector to ensure that we have policies and the regulations that actually guides and helps propel innovation. When you think about incentives to help enable the difficulties in doing Nigeria and help attract the right behavior and the right kind of funding. So the bill actually has incentives to both funders, both VCs and early stage funders, and angel funders. The bill actually gives incentives to the startups themselves. These things are all meant to propel growth. And then you have linkages, which I think is one of the real key part, where the bill actually ties private sector to, well, the bill actually brings a number of key things like university, research, Nigerian Stock Exchange, exports, a number of things that will help businesses achieve, the real realization of their vision, right? Are all put in place with this bill. And I think as one of the speakers mentioned earlier, if, and when this is implemented properly, it's going to add a lot of value to ensure that our startups are on the right track to deliver on the value that they believe that the idea should. So the bill, then the last part is the support, right? So the support part is actually supporting the supporters. So there's a lot of support around supporting hubs. There's a lot of support around encouraging local investors, like I've already said. These things, and even a free trade zone, these things are all put in place to help solve the issues of that a lot of number of startups have said, preventing them from propelling their vision into beyond ideation, into actual value creating entities. So the impact, we look at the numbers. India alone, in 2021 did about 30 additional unicorns, right? And we are still about 3 up to 5. And when we look at our numbers, we should be able to be hitting the entire market of Africa, and with new ideas that that is now hitting the world, with the idea that I think I said this earlier, maybe it was a different conversation earlier today, that the next startup that impacts the world starts in Africa, starts in the Nigerian village. And that's what this bill is meant to do. It's meant to create that enabling environment. An enabling environment, is sort of defined as how I just mentioned it, creating that collaboration between government and the private sector. Davidson just mentioned how directives can be made, from the council to solve a problem, right? So I think Davidson and I were sitting on a panel recently where the question of immigration visa was brought up. And we basically showed how the council will work, right? So if you have a issue like immigration visa, that would be bubbled up to the council through the secretariat and the consultative forum. And once it gets to the council, a directive can be given to develop a policy to help alleviate that problem. So it's really about ease of doing business and creating opportunities for ideas to flourish.
All right, thank you for throwing light on that and taking us through the 5 pillars. I'll go back to Ozofu. So we've just been given a bit of context as to implementation, but there would still be people who believe that is there really a need for the act? What really are we trying to get at? Some people believe, why don't you improve on the existing laws and all? But if there's anything that we have heard so far, it is the fact that this act is different, because what I hear is a law that is providing support as against a law that is regulated. Ozofu, what are the pitfalls to avoid in the implementation of this act in order to prevent it from being business as usual?
Thank you. I think maybe I'll start with the point you made. The last speaker made about the example about if you had a problem with a visa, then you let the council know, you bubble it up, they design a policy. I think the main pitfall I see is the macro economy that this act is going to operate within. If things are not working properly, so the visa process is not working properly, and you need to complain for them to do something about it for that startup. It begs the question, why can't they do it for everybody? So, because if it's working, then the startup probably doesn't even need to complain. It will just work the way it should. And the reason why I picked up on that was this morning I had a meeting with someone that flew into Nigeria and said that they spent maybe 2.5 hours in Nigeria in the airport waiting for the visa on arrival, and it was a very painful process. This is after a 12-hour journey to Nigeria. And I compared that with my experience flying into Kenya and the fact that Kenya has a startup bill that's going through their own legislative process. And I just thought, well, soon enough, Kenya will have the bill. They've always been a competitor with Nigeria for investor money. And then, so just thinking of the visa process, they've already got it right. It's one thing they don't need to worry themselves about. So I think the macros, getting it right, will affect the Startup Act. I think it's inevitable if we do not improve our operating environment generally and make it easy to do business generally, whether you are a startup or not. I think it will begin to affect how well the initiatives in this act can be implemented. I think another concern arising from the act is it's unless I read it wrong, it's not mandatory for a startup to register on the platform to be labeled as such. But if you want the benefits, then you will need to register. So there's an element of discretion for the startup. If they feel we don't need this now, then, and they won't take their chances just operating like any other company in Nigeria, then they can. The concern is whether this will turn into a regulator, as in somehow we then suddenly have a startup regulator and all startups are suddenly required to do this. And then maybe before you raise money, you need to get approval from it just because there is a tendency to want to regulate things in the country. Especially when it seems like there's this sector that's booming and there's no regulator there, then suddenly one day we have a regulator. So there's that concern because the current era we're in now of technology is driven by innovation, and innovation needs some sort of freedom to thrive. And so my concern is that in implementing this act, we don't find ourselves in a situation where we increase the regulatory burden on startups. Another concern is the deployment of the technology for the portal. A lot of the benefits of this act really will rest on that portal because the day-to-day, all the applications and filings, they are all to be done on the portal. So a lot will depend on whether it is deployed and maintained properly. So all the downtime, and then you complain. So I'm speaking from some of the regulators we deal with, who shall remain nameless, but have portals. You file something, downtime, the system is down this week. Next week, the system is down. The system is down for 1 month. Then the officials in the, they don't have the technological skills. So there's a consultant and they'll say they've escalated it to the consultant, but the consultant is not full-time staff. So the consultant may or may not get to it on time. So all those sorts of things, we cannot afford to have that with the portal. So, whatever resources need to be deployed and allocated to ensure that we pay for the right software, the right consultants, whatever it takes to drive this platform, it's key to this act. I think the last thing I would say is collaboration amongst regulators and MDAs. Somebody may see it as, well, this is NITDA's thing, it's not my thing. This is, CAC's thing, it's not my thing. We need to, I think on the private sector, we benefit, we know we benefit if we have one place where all startups can come and interact with various regulators on the platform and get what they need in one place. But we found from past experience that it doesn't always work like that. And it then turns into a sort of competition and you're not getting the benefit you would otherwise get. I think in terms of pitfalls, those are the things that I've seen so far.
Thank you, Ozofo. You've spoken very well, and I'm sure Mr. Kobadia has his work cut out for him with the points you have raised, very salient points, and it shows that you actually interface with a lot of these startups, because issues you have raised are the issues a lot of us, especially members in the audience who have startups as clients, face in trying to provide services to them. Davison, I'll come to you, but I need, because I want you to walk the participants through the opportunities that the Act creates for us as lawyers. Because one of the integral things that this webinar is supposed to achieve is to boost not technical know-how and have us also be at the forefront of the implementation, vis-a-vis from a place of understanding. But before I come to you, I'd like to go back to Mr. Guobadia, because Ozofo has raised some very, very important things. The implementation is key. A lot is tied to the portal. I, for one, know that the Act is not a regulatory, its intention is not to regulate. Its intention is to bring the regulators together in a place where the ecosystem participants can access them easily, cut out bureaucracies. I know that, right? Because I'm in the team. But there are also more intricate issues regarding implementation. So I'd like you to speak to those issues. The portal, how are we going to ensure that we get all the regulators together? Is there a synergy? Is there a meeting of minds? Is this a neater thing to implement? How far is the collaboration? So far, we've gotten to the Act stage with collaboration. How far is the collaboration going to take us? Is this Act going to be a collaboration thing? Or would that change at some point? Mr. Guobadia, over to you.
Yes, you're right. Those are three fantastic points that she raised, and I think that's why I took ourselves back a few minutes ago, because I realized that structure will help guide sort of the conversation going forward. The bill actually creates a framework for collaboration. So, I mean, if you look at the bill, I think 29 all down, you will see there's a lot of linkages that's basically reaching out to a number of agencies that we believe should show up to the table. So they're already in the document saying that they should come collaborate. The bill does not take up any function that these organizations already do, but more so require that they collaborate together for this particular sector. So it's intentional that we want CAC, we want patents, we want trademarks, we want export controls. We want them to come collaborate in a measured fashion through this portal for this particular sector, right? So there's that collaboration is built into the document. The idea of how the council works, and I think if you read if you look at the document, the Act again, you will see that you have a council and then you have a consultative forum, which is made up of private sector people, funders, private sector, third party people, and the labor startups themselves that sit in a consultative forum that on a day-to-day or week-to-week engage with the Secretariat. And I think, as aptly mentioned, the Secretariat is going to be housed in NITDA, right? So this conversation is where co-creation of policies and regulations will happen. And if you want to imagine, I tend to see this stuff visually. If you want to imagine on the other side of the Secretariat sits all the agencies within government that are required for the particular startup to do what their business is. So that idea of collaboration is going to be mandated down from the council, and that's some of the reasons why the council was set up the way it is, with Mr. President and Mr. Vice President driving the activities of the council to intentionally ensure that that collaborative nature is what happens, because the bill is based on collaboration, was designed, and it itself was developed on collaboration, and the core driver and what the bill intends to accomplish is collaboration and engagement between all parties. The portal, as rightfully stated, is a key part of this, right? So the portal is sort of where it all happens. If we want to envisage the portal as a place where startups meet startups, as a place where startups go to services from public sector, from the government, as a place where co-creation of policies and regulations happens, as a place where third parties come to see the labeled startups. I mean, we already had third parties sit down with us and say, hey, we read the act and this portal sounds exciting. It seems like it's a pre-DD place. Basically, if I'm looking for 10 health techs and 20 agri-techs, if they're already there in this labeled space within the portal, is a good place to start that conversation. And they're looking to invest from there or offer any additional services that they already sort of offered in a scattered version now today via the portal. Then you also look at the number of things that are out there that we hear about and we not always seem tangible. Things like loans from Bank of Industry or some activity happening in CBN that is targeted at early stage companies. Those activities will be brought onto the portal as well. So that when you come onto the portal as a label startup, it's almost like you're walking into a room, one door says CAC, you knock on it and do your activity there. You go to somewhere else and it says incentives and you look at what incentives are meant for you. Of course, this is where implementation is critical, that we ensure that we're able to bring this design from words, even description of the portal, if you read it, I thought I was being clever when I was describing the portal to a friend of mine recently, but then I went back and read the act and, it was all there to some extent on how the portal is envisaged. So it's now a case of how do we implement it to ensure that what's on paper is what comes into reality. And I take note to the fact that, being that we don't intend to replace any existing organization, we more so intend to collaborate with them, then there's still the issue of how they perform, right? So there's still the issue of how their sites work and how their processes work. Well, I think the solution there is more of a long-term, we have to take a long-term view on that. The idea of focusing on tech-enabled was intentional. And the idea of labeling startups to ensure we can track their performance is also intentional. And ultimately, you want to see that, the activities of label startups and agencies being tracked through a portal will ultimately provide results that can also be directed, right? We can now start seeing that, it's CAC, we're having issues on 100 out of 100 times. And that becomes a problem that should be bubbled up, right? So I think on the long run, we'll start having data that will help improve how we offer services to this particular sector, this is a particular intended sector. And in the end of the day, you can start doing stuff that is quite universal, like giving universal discounts across all services that are lined up in the portal. So there are a number of things that can happen once it's all set up. And it's 100% correct that how this is implemented is crucial to the success of everything. And this is where I usually segue to say, there's my good friend who you just said, Mr. Gubadia has his work cut out for him. That is, I'm trying to figure out some interesting legal word to say. No, Mr. Gubadia does not have his work cut out for him. We all have our work cut out for us, right? So everybody here is welcome to participate, read the document, understand what we're trying to achieve. And that's why I make myself available to this. This is my third one today, to ensure that we all understand what we're trying to achieve and ensure that we all participate in the process of ensuring that the best ideas win as far as implementation is concerned, right? So it's not a case where we want the idea that's just celebrated. We want the best ideas on how to really approach this to ensure that it has sustainability. The entire bill, there I go again, the entire act, if you look at it, going from council to consultative forum to secretariat to council agent to portal, is basically drenched with monitoring and evaluation and sustainability. The idea is that it has to work and it has to self-propel itself. And we need to ensure that we implement that right to guarantee that's what happens. And I think you already touched on regulation. The bill does not intend to regulate anybody. It ultimately intends to support the ecosystem. And one of my favorite provisions in the bill, as a provision to the council, says that there's no regulation or no policies shall be done or should be done. I know shall and should, and these are very important to you lawyers. without going through the council first. So it gives you a sense that there's going to be, monitoring evaluation, because the act is very intentional to ensure that we put the right train tracks in front of this train, fastest growing sector in the world, and Nigeria wants to take a position in it.
Thank you for throwing light. Davidson, we're here for you now, but there have been a lot of questions on the chat box. Please keep them coming. We'll try to pick a couple of them and address, and then share an email where you could send these questions and you get a response to your questions. But Davidson, I've seen some questions people have asked, what is the definition of startups? What is the rationale behind the benchmarks that are created in defining these startups? Somebody has also asked, would a startup qualify where it has set up its holding company offshore and the offshore company has at least 1/3 of its ownership owned by Nigerians? So these are questions coming from practitioners who are advising and representing startups. And this is one of the things that we practitioners think about when a new law comes. How does it impact our clients? So I'd like you to, with those questions in mind, you can also view the chat box. Take us through the opportunities for lawyers, highlighting the implication of some of these definitions under the Act. And if there are anything we as legal practitioners should know, and if there's any homework we should do or any interface we need to have with our clients to position them to benefit from this Act. Over to you, Davidson.
All right, thank you. I will try and just pick on a few things as much as I can. So definition of startups, right? We were quite careful here, even though there's an extent to which we can be careful. But again, we wanted it to be clear that this was not extending to SMEs, that small and medium enterprises. They already have SMED, and we see how that's working for them. So this is targeted towards tech-enabled startups. So the Act actually defines startups, companies of not more than 10 years, the objectives being creation, innovation, development, production, or adoption of a unique technology, innovative product, service, or process. And again, that means that you have to be in that space where you are operating using technology to provide goods and services to your clients. And I think to a fair extent, we know what tech-enabled startups look like, especially when we juxtapose them with your traditional modes of businesses. I mean, there's Uber, which is tech-enabled, and then you have your taxis, who operate a different model. So those were the kind of folks we were looking at when we were defining startups. So I guess for lawyers, it's having that understanding around the types of businesses that are being targeted at the end of the day, and then seeing where your client fits within all of that. Now, other than that, too, we've looked at some of the tax incentives that exist under the Act. So to be able to advise your client on what they need to consider and how they can be positioned for those incentives. One thing to note about the Act is it can apply to a company of 1 year. It can equally apply to a company of 5 years, provided you meet up with the labeling process. Now, there's a tax incentive period for about 5 years in the Act. So that means a 5-year company can actually enjoy the incentives for that 5-year period. A company of 1 year, can actually, start off from that 1 year and enjoy the tax incentives, especially for the company's income tax incentives that are there. We had introduced a clause earlier on the possibility of being able to renew, those incentives for a possible period of another 2 years. But what you also need to be able to advise your client about is that because of that limitation of 10 years, that means they cannot extend beyond 10 years. So they will have to then be on a case-by-case basis with respect to how how many years your client already has. There are also incentives too for pioneer status. For lawyers who deal with the NIPC, that is the Nigerian Investment Promotion Commission, there are those challenges that are typically faced trying to get approval from that place. I've done quite a number, probably takes an average of 9 to 18 months to get that done, but what the act is looking at is an expeditious approval process. There's supposed to be 100 million naira share capital. What the act has actually provided though is that if you are labeled, then it sort of grants you some form of special treatment that can be given to you by virtue of that process. There was something that Joseph had mentioned. It's probably important to just sneak this in here, that we did have an engagement with over 40 MDAs where we sort of spoke to them over the space of 2 days about what the act was going to be. And they also had the opportunity to give their feedback on some of those provisions and see how that collaborative process can work. It sort of helps because some of them didn't know what a startup was, but at the end of the day, their understanding around it grew. Some of the organizations like NoTap, for instance, that deals with technology transfer, got to understand how these interactions can actually take place in a very collaborative way. And I think for lawyers as well, being able to guide your clients that are seeking to transfer technology or to import technology, that under this labeling process and on the portal, that whole process will be made much easier for them. For folks who want to register their patents or their trademarks in the US or overseas, by being labeled as well, they have that opportunity for the Ministry of Trade, as well as need that to work with your client towards being able to register their patents and trademarks and other IP rights outside Nigeria. There are also clauses there around regulatory interventions that deals with Central Bank of Nigeria, the SEC. If you're trying to get involved in crowdfunding or you're a fintech trying to get a license as well, there are provisions there that sort of lead to that collaborative process that Oswald spoke about, whereby you can then have your client that is labeled. Of course, there will still be the normal process because, again, to touch briefly on what Oswald said, we didn't want to create rules and regulations. We want existing rules and regulations to still exist as they are. But what will then happen is, because of that collaboration, it then makes it easier for you that are labeled to pass through most of those processes. So the labeling is almost like a gold standard that gives you access to a number of things that you would find challenges with. And I think being able to advise your clients around how some of those mechanisms would work would be very useful as well. There are a couple of questions here, so I don't know whether you would want to pick them and then have us answer the particular ones.
Well, we have this webinar is strictly 1 hour, and we barely have 4 minutes to go. So we'll try to get to the questions. I have looked at the questions. Most of the issues raised, questions have been addressed by the responses of the panelists. So I'll just take parting comments from the 3 speakers. Let's start with Ozofo.
I think maybe as part of my parting comments, like I said, the Act establishes a very laudable framework. I think a lot of the gaps will have to be filled in by regulation and policy to let guide startups on how they can access maybe the funding, what they need to do, what sort of lenders can benefit from the guarantee, that sort of thing. So we look forward to seeing this and having an opportunity to review it ahead of it being being passed and becoming effective. I think the last thing I'll say is that timely and efficient implementation is required. So I think that the work of the council has already been set out, of the coordinator and all those involved need that. So the policies, we need to see the regulations, they need to be work in progress right now. The portal, setting it up. We need to make sure we execute this in a timely manner and in an efficient manner, so that in a few months, by the time we're in 2023, the various initiatives will be up and running. Thank you.
Thank you, Ozofo. Mr. Guabadia, your parting comments.
I think it would be fair to give the non-lawyer in the house the final parting comments, but you've already called my name, so I'll go ahead. I'm being lawyered here. So I would say that, this is just phase one. And what I tell people is the work is still ahead. I've told the team, go ahead and celebrate, but we're back at it, and we understand that implementation is critical. I mean, there's two parts to phase two. The first part being implementation, which we're currently beating ourselves through an implementation document right now to get it right. And the second part is state adoption. We believe that every state in the country should adopt the Nigerian Startup Act to complete the fabric of innovation across the country. States should be competing on policy, and where startups go, policy should play a big part. So a few states have already expressed their interest in this, and that's already is being worked. And the last thing I'll say is that this work was done by volunteers. People volunteered of their time, and I mean, Uyi is one of my biggest volunteers here, and we welcome all of you to join in and contribute your bit to ensuring that people are aware with the legal minds of what the Startup Act intends to do, and then also participate with your ideas to ensure that we're able to implement this correctly. So it's all on us. It's an excellent opportunity to test citizen responsibility and trying to work for something that's really for all of us. So thank you very much for having me, and I welcome other opportunities.
Thank you. Davidson, you close. Before you close, as soon as Davidson is done, the webinar will be formally closed. However, I'm going to crave the indulgence of our speakers to stay back for a few minutes for informal Q&A with the attendees who have questions. But once Davidson is done, we'll close the webinar. Davidson, over to you.
Yeah, sure. So I'll keep it short. Yeah, so, I mean, a couple of things have been touched on here, right? Implementation is key. You can have a very lovely piece of work, but if there is a gap in being able to implement it, then everything is, turned out to just be the waste. So vigilance on our part is very crucial. And for legal practitioners, there is a lot for us to play, being able to advise our clients, being able to scrutinize the act. Feel free to come up with your recommendations and criticism, and share with us. We typically talk about there being a 2.0. The importance at the end of the day, it is for the startup ecosystem to thrive, and grow. And I think having this act in place is a step in the right direction, and it can only get better. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Davidson. Thank you. Our distinguished panelists, very, very wonderful attendees. The council, I want to thank you all for attending this webinar. Before we close, I'd like to remind you that January is around the corner. Time for you to renew your membership of the NBA section on business law. You will agree with me that the section on business law is one of the most pivotal sections of the Nigerian Bar Association that impacts on you as a lawyer, especially one in the corporate and commercial business space. So please keep it in mind to renew your memberships once the call for it is made in January. I'm sure Endurance will keep you on that. On this note, I'd like to thank you all. Like I said earlier, we're going to have an informal session with those who have questions. The panelists will be around to answer. But at this point, I'd like to thank you all. And on behalf of the chairman of the MBA section of business law, Dr. Adeoye Adefolo, it's my pleasure to declare this webinar closed. Thank you for attending, and I wish you all well. Okay, so we can now have questions, but this is not going to be free falling. So if you will take a few questions and then wrap up, because I know our panelists have a lot to do. Davidson, someone was asking what a labeled startup means. Right, someone was asking a question on labeling. Can you throw some light, right?
Yeah, sure. So the labeling process is one where you can consider it like a badge of some sort, that is granted to certain startups. And so it then grants them access to quite a number of incentives that are provided under the Act. Note that there are some general incentives that the Act provides, but then there are specific ones for label startups. Now, I had mentioned earlier, using Tunisia as an example, that labeling process allows you to go into some form of incubation process with the regulator, whereby they're able to track your progress and determine your growth, more or less. So you have access to funding, you have access to credit guarantee schemes, you have access to tax breaks and a few other things. The Act provides for the point. The second point was that its objects are towards innovation, improve existing technology development.
Okay, I think we're having a problem hearing Davison. Can the other panelists hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Okay, yeah, we can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Yes, so I was explaining the labeling process. So registered under CAMA. The objects are towards innovation and technology. If you possess intellectual property or you have registered software, qualify for labeling. Now, there was the provision there, and so this provision, there were quite some battles around it, and Oswald won that battle. So if for somebody to give credit or beefing towards, then is Oswald, is for the small startups to have access to these your Flutterwave, Piggy, and the rest of them. I mean, most of them receive.
Okay, I think there's some issue with Davison's network, but Mr. Gwabada is here, so he can answer this question. Chinedu Sunday is asking, when will the startup portal be launched? I know you've spoken generally to it, but do we have any bit of a timeline we can work with?
Not yet. We're still trying to get the implementation plan going. As in everything else, you have to have an agreement on the pathway to implementation to be able to set a schedule. But I can tell you, within the team, we don't intend to not have this established prior to the government that leaves leaving. So we're working on it.
Okay, great. Also, while we still have you, someone had also asked that, are there other benefits other than labeling, that startups who are not labeled can avail themselves of with the Act, under the Act? So what are the other benefits? So let's say I don't want to get labeled. Is there still anything I could, benefit from?
So what I've said, about this is that, being labeled does not now mean that you're the only startups. I mean, there's still going to be startups. SMEs are startups, and I think we almost want to think of tech-enabled as the VIPs of the SME, with this intentionality of Startup Build Act for them. But if you look at a lot of the provisions around even supporting the supporters, it says we're going to support hubs, but it does not now tell the hub who to support, right? It doesn't say the supported hub must only support labeled startups. It just lets the hub go do what the hub does. So there's going to be a general infusion of support and benefits that go into the entire ecosystem, that companies who are not, or whom are not labeled will still gain benefits. And even if you now look into linkages into NUC, and we now build a stronger linkage into NUC, and we're now pushing up a larger volume of computer students. Nowhere in the Act does it say that they can only work for labeled startups. It just says, you're now trained, go off and get work. And that very much well could be for just any startup or any organization. You end up being a bank, right? So the fact is that this is just meant to improve on the ecosystem from multiple angles. And then we're taking companies that are labeled in, and there's certain benefits that go directly to them. And we want to be able to monitor and evaluate. I mean, if you look at some of the criteria around what the label startup is supposed to do, they really are submitting their numbers, actually. We need to see progress. We need to see that, these initiatives are working to progress you. And they allow us to, I think, as Davidson already hinted at, to start looking at what changes might need to be done on another version. In Tunisia, they're working on 2.0. And, a KPI would be that, a year from now, somebody on this conversation is now the driving force between NSA 2.0, driving a number of amendments that are now being derived from our learned experience on what worked and what did not work, and what delivered value and what did not deliver value.
Okay, thank you very much. Is Davidson back? Okay. Anyway, still staying with. Oh, you're okay, Davidson. You're back. All right, great. Adamu Abubakar Ishak is asking a question, and he's talking of Part 4, which I think deals with training and capacity building. And he says, that interests him. He's wondering how that part is going to be implemented. Any pointers?
So what's the question again? So
Adamu Abubakar Ishak was saying Part 4 of the Act is Part 6, of the Act is the part that interests him the most. And that part talks about training and capacity building, right? And he's asking, what is the implementation plan? How would that part be implemented?
Okay, well, so it's sort of a collaborative effort. And again, the spirit to a large extent behind the Act had to do with collaboration, right? Because you can't be trying to implement trainings on your own without having the buy-in of the organizations and entities that you're looking to work with. So for instance, there are provisions there on talent development as well. And we're very careful, we use that word collaborate a lot. And like I said, the engagement we had with the MDAs took us down that path, because we realized that there was a lot of territorial, grandstanding towards this belongs to us, so don't try and come here. And we're trying to let them understand that, look, the eventual plan of everything is for the ecosystem to thrive. And if the ecosystem thrives, Nigeria's economy eventually gets better. So I'll give you an example. I believe it's Section 22 of the Act that says that that NIDA, being the secretariat, will collaborate with the universities, commission, tertiary institutions, regulatory bodies, to develop modules, programs, hold workshops, and all of that. So that's a lot of work, right? That has to go into play, which means that there will be that consistent engagement. A lot of people don't know a number of things around running a startup, around what the business environment is. NIDA plays, to an extent, some kind of role for tech-enabled startups. And we're looking at a situation where they can then create models and programs, and then hold periodic workshops in the different geopolitical zones where they can then be promoting, technology utilization and generally having those, engagements where there's a consistent upskilling of the students and even those who are trying to learn. The Industrial Training Fund, where monies are contributed annually and people don't see the result of it. We also look for a way to bring them in, whereby startups can have trainings that are facilitated by the ITF. So, because it's Industrial Training Fund, right? So it deals with training, but if you can't track who is being trained, then it almost looks like it's a bottomless pit. And we're looking for a way that NIDA can then collaborate with the ITF to have the right type of training, unlock some of those funds without making it clear that that's what we're trying to do, but be able to unlock the funds that ITF has to carry out trainings for people. Again, a lot of collaboration is going to be involved in that. It just means that NIDA has to be, or the Secretariat now, has to be consistently aware of its objectives and the framework that it's supposed to operate with under the Startup Act. But then this is one of those situations that Oswald sort of referenced, where it's not just labeled startups now that will enjoy this incentive. And it's not even just startups and those in the ecosystem that will directly enjoy from it. Folks, even in university, private sector individuals, those in academic research as well can also benefit from the Nigerian Startup Act and eventually get fed into the system, and it keeps growing like that.
Okay, great. Just two other questions, and then we'll let we close this informal session. Still on the training, Benson Tegu had asked earlier what categories of startups will qualify for the training and capacity building, and then how will Nigerians living outside the major cities in Nigeria qualify for this training? I know that this is one of the reasons why we're talking about state adoption, getting states to latch on so that they can also, contextualize the benefits of the act in their own states. But I'd like you to also speak to, how we're going to categorize startups who qualify.
Hello. Hello.
Davidson, it appears that we have lost our moderator. Did you get the gist of the question?
Okay. All right. Oh, okay. I just was wondering what happened. I was saying that someone had asked the categories of startups that qualify for the training. So I was saying still on the training. Benson Tegu had asked what categories of startups will qualify for the training and capacity building, and how do you handle those who are living outside the major cities in Nigeria? And just putting it into context, I had mentioned that this is why we're pushing for state adoption, to get the states to contextualize the benefits. But I'd like you to speak to the categorization of startups who qualify for training.
Yeah, so well, I would say that, I mean, I've already touched on part of the area of training, right? That it's basically everyone who finds themselves in that, in those different pockets that are identified under the provisions that deal with capacity building and talent development. So it's all startups, because if you read the letter of the Act, when it's referring to labeled startups, then it's specific, but when you get to that part 6, right, that deals with training capacity building, it then opens it up to startups, because startups have already been defined under the Act, and labor startups have been defined as well. So it's open to all categories of startups. Now, again, even that section talks about the different geopolitical zones, right? The 6 geopolitical zones. And so the Secretariat is supposed to establish centers in those 6 geopolitical zones where there can be promotion of digital technology, information sharing, and strengthening of the knowledge of startups in those areas. But then we had also mentioned, state adoption, where we're looking at different states adopting, provisions of the Nigerian Startup Act, and for want of a better word, domesticating it for themselves. So each state will then have something similar to the Nigerian Startup Act, but is relevant for that state and for the climate that they find themselves in. And we've had a couple of states, like Kaduna State is almost at the tail end of adopting the Nigeria Startup Act. We've had the engagement with Edo State, Lagos State as well. So a couple of them are looking at adopting the Nigeria Startup Act and making it, personal and specific to their different states. So it's open to all startups. And not only does the Secretariat intend to establish centers in the 6 geopolitical zones, but if states adopt it, it also brings it home to people living in the rural areas as well, that are, startups that are tech-enabled and so can enjoy this sort of incentive, which can even extend to an extent, SMEs that are trying to pivot to become startups as identified under the Act. But, it doesn't then have that labeling process that limits who can enjoy this particular incentive. So I hope that has answered that sufficient.
Yeah, I think it does. Adiola Fayoshe is asking that her understanding of Section 7.2a makes it appear like the council has powers to review tech regulations, CBN regulations, and the likes. And she's wondering how that would work. Right.
Oh, well, that's an interesting observation. And, I hear you, though. I hear you. And that's one of the reasons why we have, number one, Mr. President on the council. Secondly, that's why this is the Nigeria Startup Act. Now, if you go to, the earlier sections, I believe it's Section 1, of the Act, it sets out what the objectives are, and it is to provide a legal and institutional framework for the development of startups in Nigeria. That's the very first, clause in Section 1. And then you have the other ones, provide an enabling the environment and all of that. So we're trying to derive a level of legitimacy from that Section 1 to say that where MDAs are going to come up with policies and directives that may affect the operation, establishment, and investment in the startup, because this act is supposed to be specific to this, sector. Now, the council should have a say, right, in those kind of policies that will be rolled out, because consistently we've seen how policies and directives, are rolled out from these places, and somebody's business possibly gets wiped out overnight. We've seen it happen to those in the crypto space without any forewarning. We've seen it happen to those fintechs involved in foreign share dealings. It just happens out of the blues, and so we're looking at the situation where the council would be able to review those policies and directives. Now, whether the purpose of reviewing it is to change, what the MDAs want to issue is a different, question entirely. But we consider that having this here would at least allow the council have a say in those sort of situations, rather than, because what's the purpose of an act to an extent if we cannot harmonize and bring the level of consistency and predictability to what these startups would face. Again, note that we're not trying to create policies for those areas. We're simply saying that they should have the power to review these policies because it's going to affect that space. So that was the understanding behind creating that provision, basically.
Great. Okay. So, guys, the questions are still coming in, but I'm sure that everyone the panelists need to go. 2 have even left, and there's still so much. So the conversation is still going to be ongoing. What we're going to do is SBL is going to take down all the questions. The ones we haven't answered, we will get back to them and send a response to everyone. So if you have questions, put them on the chat box with your email address and we'll get to you. Also, if you haven't gotten a copy of the gazetted version of the Act, please indicate with your email and we will send it to you. I'm sure there's going to be a means of sharing the gazetted copy. Please refrain from reviewing the versions, the many versions that are circulating. Make sure you have the gazetted copy and that's signed by the president. That said, I'd like to thank Davidson for sitting on the hot seat very well and addressing the questions. I'd like to also thank Chair for still staying and remind you all that next week on the 10th of November, we're back here again. This time we'll be discussing another topical issue that impacts heavily on the economy and the nation in general. Do's and don'ts when a corruption issue arises in your organization. It's going to be coordinated by the CRC committee, and it promises to be as exciting as today's session is. So make a date. As soon as you get that email from SBL, register and mark your calendars to join. There's a lot of promise with the webinar, and there's so many benefits that could come to members. Please also encourage colleagues that you know who are not registered members of the SBL to register and become a member of the SBL, because the benefits to you as a lawyer and to your practice is enormous. So I want to thank you all, and at this juncture, we want to now close the informal session. But before we do that, I'll ask you all to put on your cameras, and let's take a screenshot for the records, and possibly say NSA or something. Hoping Endurance and the team at SBL can do that. Even if we don't unmute you, seeing your mouth move, that will work for us. So please switch on your cameras, and on the count of 1, 2, and go, you just say NSA. NSA means Nigeria Startup Act. Hope the guys at SBL have this all ready. I hope you're ready to take these shots. Okay, are we ready to go? I believe yes. I can see my chairman is smiling. Okay, so 1, 2, go. NSA.
Yeah.
Go. NSA. Hope we got that.
Yeah.
Great, great. Thank you all for joining, and we'll get back to you with the Act and answers to your question. Have a lovely evening.